Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here with us today. I have the pleasure, and I'm very excited to kick the conference off this morning. My name is Annabella Martin. I'm a Global Business Development Manager for Hilti, and I also am the chair for CII Supply Chain Management Community of Business Advancement. This morning, we're going to be talking about what it takes to establish a material management system to optimize your AWP implementation. Now, before we get started, I'd like to have our panelists turn on their camera so I could introduce the rest of the team today. All right. So we have with us today, Robert Hood is a project and account manager for IntelliWave Technologies. Thanks, Robert, for being here. We have Eric Cravella, who is the Director of Business Development at Digital Construction Works. I think most everybody knows Eric because he is also our AWP Jedi Master and leads the AWP Community of Business Advancement. We also have Joel Peterson. Joel is our crypt keeper for today. Material manager. Joel is with Performance Contractors, and he leads the corporate advanced work packaging group and workplace planning team, and will be sharing with us today some of the horror stories from the field. And I've gone ahead and introduced myself. So again, thank you for being here. Please make sure to ask lots of questions. We want to make this a fun and interactive session for today. So what are our objectives for today? Why is material management important for our capital project? So we'll talk about, and I'll bewitch you with some of the information that we have from recent CII research teams 344 and 363. Joel will then share with us, again, some of the horror stories and challenges we face day to day related to materials and properly programming the information that we need to be able to inform decisions and execute our project. Then Robert is going to walk us through how we can leverage existing digital solutions to establish enhanced material management systems. And then last but not least, Eric is going to share with us the number of CII resources that exist related to integrated material management that our organizations can leverage. We'll close off with each of the panelist sessions doing a takeaway, so our own personal takeaways from the session, and then Stephen and Lloyd will help us moderate the questions that have come in through the audience. So why is material management important? We've learned from RT 344 that materials can make up 40 to 50% of the project cost, and they can influence 80% of the schedule. So it is critical that we take a closer look at our material management strategies, which falls under the supply chain function within many of our organizations, and really elevate that supply chain and material management strategy in par with the the work and the activities that we conduct in the engineering and construction functions. Now, obviously, that's easier said than done because, as we know, we have a very, very complex global supply chain. And obviously, that's made even more complex these days due to some of the challenges that we've been living through with the pandemics. We know that we have stakeholders spread all over the world, and most of us are probably living through some of the challenges related to transportation and logistics, new government regulations that are coming through the pandemic, quality related to some of the challenges from constrained manufacturing partners, just to name a few. And aside from that, I think we also have to be grateful and very appreciative to our supply chain partners and our supply chain functions within our organizations that, given the very rough seas that we have these days with the pandemic, are still trying to do the best they can to make sure that materials are being made available to the sites to be able to work on and execute the project. Now, There's other things, obviously, that exist outside of the challenges that we've been having with the pandemic, and a lot of it having to do with some of the organizational and IT challenges that we see. So again, this is a slide from RT344, which really started to take a deeper look into how could we improve material planning and work packaging by taking a closer look at our supply chain. So some of the takeaways from that particular research team concluded that we're still working, and even within our own organizations, we find ourselves that we're extremely siloed. We're working with disparate data systems and IT systems, and what we refer to as an asymmetric data flow, where information is flowing in one direction, maybe from the owner to the EPC to the supplier, and not necessarily coming back up to really be able to have a productive discussion and dialogue and data sharing. And then misaligned incentives, whether they be functionally within an organization or contractually between external stakeholders. So these are areas definitely where there can be some significant improvement as we continue to really augment the role of the supply chain in our project. So what's needed? And this is probably not going to be a surprise to any of you. We need data. And it's not that we already don't have a lot of data, but we need to find a better way of organizing that data and making it accessible to the right players at the right time in order to be able to improve the decision-making process. And so why is it that we have some of these challenges related to data? And again, this is from RT344, and an insight that we took into our survey that we conducted with 218 owner EPCs and supplier companies. And these, you can see, are some of the barriers that were listed from that research. And I'd like to highlight the top 3 here, where you can see that some of the challenges and the barriers relate to organizational silos, right? And so, you know, if even within our organization we're siloed, what kind of expectations, realistic expectations, can we have to communicate and share information outside of our own organization? So this is somewhere where we need to take a very close look internally at our organizations, and then obviously how we interface with external stakeholders. And then the 2 really are related to the incompatibility of IT systems and then material data not being in the IT system. And this is where I'd like to stress, and I know Robert's going to talk about this, it's not that the data doesn't exist, it's just that it's not in the right place. So building on the work that was conducted with RT344, RT363 continued to look at how can we improve and better integrate AWP integrate supply chain into the AWP framework. And really the team came away with 3 solution parameters. Augment your supply chain processes. Make supply chain, material management, procurement, key stakeholders in the decision-making and the alignment and the planning of a project, and not simply a support function. Integrate your suppliers. Challenge your suppliers and engage with them in a dialogue even before an RFQ or in a contract, so on an evergreen type of level at the enterprise level, to see what are their capabilities. You know, we really look at our supplier community and see what they can deliver in terms of safety and quality, but can they support the execution of a project given an AWP framework? In the RT344 research that we conducted, and we interviewed a number of suppliers, many of them knew about AWP, but they didn't know the details of, the specific details of what it meant to execute a project in AWP and what kind of impacts it would have with them. So I think this is really where we have a huge opportunity to educate our supplier community and our OEMs and really look at how can we work with them to make them partners in this capital project execution phase, align with them early, and to make sure that really we're then aligning on the material needs and making sure that we're sharing the risk properly. And then the third recommendation or solution parameter was around the creation of a digital supply chain. A digital supply chain, and I think here I can probably reference John Fish, where he talks about the seamless flow of information from end to end through a properly coordinated digital supply chain. Now, obviously, we know that this is easier said than done, but this is an area where we need to focus. And so these solution parameters here really help create a condition where if we were to evaluate these 3 areas in our organizations, we really have the potential of maximizing AWP and the benefit that comes from AWP. And so these highlight and summarize some of these opportunities that I just mentioned here. So with this, I'd like to now turn it over to our crypt keeper, Mr. Joel, to have him walk through some of his day-to-day challenges that he faces. So Joel, the floor is yours.
Joel, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Annabelle, and welcome to all attendees out there in the virtual world. I'm hoping that you guessed from my headshot that I'm excited about the upcoming holiday weekend. A little quick background on me. I started with performance in 2006 after 15 fun-filled years in the snowmaking industry. And then in 2015, I was tasked with development and integration and then implementation of a AWP workplace planning program process for our company. And now when I talk about AWP there, I use it somewhat loosely because while we control our workplace planning destiny where we build the packages and so forth, we don't always have control of the front-end planning portion of the AWP process, and that's where engineering and procurement need to align along the path of construction. And that's really the heart and soul of this, I believe. Quite often, I'll be on a project and the mindset will be, hey, we're doing workplace planning, we're building IWPs, we're going to see a 10% savings in total installed costs and so forth. And I'm not saying that can't be true, but there's a lot more to it than just building IWPs. And as an example, I was on a project a few years ago where we had probably close to 400 piping packages. And by the time piping activities were starting, we didn't have one package that was constraint-free from a material perspective. So you could see that the front-end portion of that did not quite align with the material delivery. So building IWPs is the easy part. The secret sauce is getting the material delivery correct. So I've been asked to bring a construction perspective to this session, and which is establishing a material management system to optimize AWP implementation. Now, I like to think in the big scheme of material management, the contractor doesn't need the full pie, he needs a slice of it. And what I mean is, we're not concerned with tracking every widget that goes into making a spool from cradle to grave. While that's important to whoever's managing the piping fabricator, for us, we're more interested in what's the final product. Where's that spool along the fabrication journey? So it's not always the same overlap of the material needs. So the first item I'm going to cover is about material visibility. What's on site? If not, when it's going to be on site, what's issued, and what's in inventory. And in 2015, it didn't take long to see the need for good dynamic data integration. I would have supervision. It was easy to clear an IWP to say, hey, all the material here, or is it not? But it's quite a task to constantly doing that with different siloed data sources. And I would see our supervision go to fabrication reports, load delivery sheets, material received trackers, and try to figure out what was coming up. So while we would provide that information, it wasn't dynamic like we needed to. So the first one I'm going to touch on is civil. And I just want to point out that all disciplines are not equal, and some have more challenges than others. And now, full disclosure here, for civil, on the projects I've been involved with, we've only done civil a couple times. Quite often we go to a project and they say it's anchor bolts up. And I'm not sure if that's from not planning up front to get us on there on site to do the civil, but that's what my experiences has been. So for the most part, I think civil is somewhat easy compared to the other ones. And part of the reason is that a big portion of the material for foundation are commodities. You've got rebar, you've got concrete. Those are pretty readily available. You also have anchor bolts and embeds, but those aren't typically long lead time items. The other thing that's nice about civil is that when you do have fabricated material, if you're pre-bending steel and so forth and rebar, it comes to you in a bundle. It doesn't come piecemealed out from foundation to foundation. It comes as a group. So the other thing that does require a little bit of effort is the precast portion. So all your duct banks, your catch basin, manholes, and things like that, we need to sequence that material as well as get good feedback from the fabricator. Oh, there we go. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about structural steel and spools. Typically, we have pretty good information in this area, and this we get typically is from our fabricator reports. And those fabricator reports allow us to see what's been detailed typically, where it is along the fabrication journey, and typically that information relates back to the drawing. So we are able to tie that in usually pretty well. Along with the fabricator report, a steel schedule also allows us to get pretty good ETAs for when the material should be coming. Civil and steel are different than pipe to where they've already been pre-compartmentalized. So when you get steel to a job site, it's coming in it with a job number that is already pre-compartmentalized to a certain structure. So those have a little bit of leg up on the piping portion of this. The one caveat to using the fab reports for your data source is that quite often the owner wants to know, hey, where are we at with our material? How many spools are here? What's the tonnage of steel and so forth? When we use the fabricator reports, we don't have a complete picture until everything has been detailed. So those are all pretty easy. Now the next portion I'm going to cover real quick is your field material, the MTO. To me, this is where the biggest pain point, and this is where the biggest issue that I typically have, and I call this the Holy Grail. And quite often, we don't have that information on the front end, and I will try to get it from the engineer who typically that's where this information is generated. They're the upstream person to generate this data. So I've always feel like if we can get a good handoff of this information from engineering, it makes things much simpler and reduces the duplication of efforts. But that's not always the case, and you don't always get it in one simple source as well. The other pain point that goes along with this is that it's not unusual for us to get MTO information that is not rev controlled. And what I mean there is that we don't know, we know what's on a drawing, but that drawing may not be indicated what rev it was when it was taken off. So while that's great and probably 98% of the material is going to be accurate, you still have that little bit of doubt that you need to go back and double check everything with the rev. So I'm hoping in the future that we might be able to employ some PCF files that are given to the fabricator. But if I've investigated and gone down this path, I've been told by fabricators that this isn't always the best option for various reasons that I'm not going to get into at this moment. So another issue that we have when it comes to the MTO is, as a contractor, we build off the isometric, and we need to have the data attributed to the individual drawing. It's not unusual to come on a project and we'll have an MTO that is rolled up to the line. So it might have 6 or 7 drawings to that line, or what they might call ISO. And that makes it very difficult for us to be able to pull out and provide visibility, because you might have an IWP that breaks in between that series of that line on all those different sheets. So we really need to have that attributed down to the individual ISO. The other thing that is a pain point for me is that when we go to a project and a material management system has been deployed, there'll be a lot of information there. And like I said, we don't need all that information necessarily. And so what we need to be able to do is to be able to separate and segregate that information to what is important to us in the field. So one example would be, as far as piping material goes, we need to be able to separate what is the field material versus what is the shop material. And surprisingly, that's not always that easy to do. So, but like I said, this information is pretty important, especially, like I said, if you're employing a material management system and software out there. Oops, one too far. Now, the last portion I'm going to cover here, which is another pain point, is visibility to equipment information. And typically on a project, we're somewhat blind to what has been ordered until the material arrives. You might get a heads up to say, hey, here's a packing list, we're going to be coming and delivering this material. But up to that point, you really don't know what you're going to be getting. And it's very hard to tell someone, hey, where are we at with material, when you don't have any information to reconcile against that. So that is one issue that would be nice to be resolved. Excuse me. The other issue that we'll find when we do receive material is that the packing list is often rolled up to a level where it doesn't provide enough detail. So we end up having to get our equipment people to come in and dissect and take a look at all the individual pieces, because we can't receive the material to the component level that we need to provide that material visibility to them. The last point I'm going to touch on here is some nomenclatures on the equipment field, on the equipment area. Quite often they'll be mismatched. You'll have a vendor that calls something a certain, has a certain name for it, whereas the engineer, they might be calling it something different. And we need to have that Rosetta Stone that allows us to link those pieces together. And that is something we typically don't have. So what is ideal is for us to be able to receive something in the way that the people in the field are going to ask for it. They're going to look at the drawing and ask for it that way. So that's the way we need to receive it. So that's what I've got on material visibility. And now the last point I'm going to touch on how we can optimize a material management system to improve AWP implementation is to be able to deliver completable IWPs. Now, where the rubber meets the road, I feel, is within piping. I think later on in the conference, we're going to talk about the differences between disciplines and so forth. And I have a strong opinion that, you know, piping is where you get the bang for your buck. There's value in it everywhere, but piping is the one where we definitely have the biggest pain points. And so what are our issues with this that cause us to not be able to deliver completable IWPs? Typically, we're waiting on spools. And what has happened is the spool delivery has not been aligned with the IWPs. And what could be some of the reasons for that? Well, engineering and procurement have not been aligned with the path of construction, something I touched on earlier. Quite often, on the initial prioritization of piping spools, they might be using it by CWP. And so maybe our initial piping priorities are too broad. I can give you an example. I was on a project where the path of construction, say, went through area 111. And in this area, there was a 10-story structure with piping up and down it. And that was our #1 piping priority. However, even though that was the #1 piping priority, we had lots of other areas that needed spools. And we did not need the piping material that was on the 3rd, 4th, 5th, up to the 10th deck on that for several months down the road. So after we got the IWPs developed, we adjusted all the IWP priorities and were able to give the pipe fabricator these new priorities. However, getting those integrated into their process seemed to be quite a challenge. So I think this is where probably the biggest opportunity for improvement exists out there. And as I alluded to earlier on the other project, quite often you'll be on a project and they'll say, hey, well, what about piping activities? When are we going to start? Well, when we get 65, 70% of the spools. Well, I know that that's a kind of an old adage, but I don't think that's necessarily a good rule of thumb. And I think we need to have a new outlook on this and say, hey, let's plan this better to where why don't we start thinking about, let's start when we have 30, 40% of the spools on site, because those 30 or 40% of the spools are the ones you need. So hopefully that next step is not too far off, but we'll get there. And again, engineering, procurement, material delivery, alignment, that is the key to this. So I'll leave it with that. Those are my pain points, and I'm going to hand it off to Mr. Robert Hood.
Perfect. Thank you, Joel. Just skip ahead a slide here. All right, so just a quick introduction on myself. As Joel alluded, Robert Hood. My background, I started in construction, on the tools. I did that for roughly 6 years, decided to go and get my engineering degree, and then started here at a technology company because after going through the pain points that we see in the field every day, I wanted to, be part of the solution. So with that, I've worked with some awesome clients on some awesome projects along the road. And what I'll go through today is kind of, some of the solutions that exist today that in practice have, been proven to deliver the results. And especially when we talk about, implementing a materials management system when optimizing AWP, these are things that I think, should be considered moving forward. All right, so first I'd like to start with some stats. So there was a study done by FMI that identified that roughly 95.5% of all data captured in engineering and construction goes unused. Why? Well, as we all know, construction is very traditional, and the traditional approach has been very siloed. So as Annabella mentioned earlier, the siloed approach really impedes visibility, and it's a tale as old as time. But it is something that, I think that there's a digitization trend right now that we're going through, which also here with this conference we're helping to drive. And part of the reason why data goes unused is that roughly 90% of all data is unstructured. So that can be pictures, pen and paper, phone calls, activity logs, etc. So things that are hard for a machine to necessarily sift through, which require much more manual effort and oftentimes just get overlooked due to the time constraints. The same study found that roughly only 30% of engineering companies have applications that, found that 30% of engineering companies have applications that don't integrate, which means that roughly 70% of the industry is still in this siloed approach. And only 8% of engineering and construction firms have what they call real-time full project management information systems that allow for dashboard reporting. So how do we fix this? Digitization and collaboration would be the two keywords I would take away from this. So we talk about this, concept of a single source of truth, which is really a real-time collaborative digital ecosystem that provides visibility to all silos. The biggest thing here is collaboration is what really drives the trust in the data. And as anyone here can attest to, anyone who's tried to implement something, the biggest deterrent to adoption on a project to any system or software is data integrity. The moment that you don't feel that you can rely on the data in the system, it almost becomes useless. So through enhanced real-time collaboration, that's one of the biggest benefits of this single source of truth. So one of the major takeaways here, which will be kind of a theme throughout my slides, is that it's not that the data doesn't exist, it's just more likely that you don't have access to it, and that's more so alluding to the siloed approach. All right, so first, building off of the not having access to vital information, we get to the engineering and design. So a big player here is having these electronic versions of MTOs, bills of material, drawings, really integrated into the materials management system to provide that real-time material availability that's needed for planning. But on the other side of that, when we talk about this collaborative ecosystem, it's also sending back, this material status, whether it's issued, whether it's installed, to the modeling software to really help paint the overall picture of where we're at in terms of project status. And on the right hand side here, we have a picture of a system that's available today. Again, anything that you see in terms of the screenshots here, like always, do your due diligence, find out what works for you. But this is an existing solution on the market today that can help provide this level of like visibility and collaboration that we're alluding here to today. Okay, active supplier management. So this is one of the bigger points today here. So I'm amongst the major issues that have been covered today, and I think that anybody has experienced is that there seems to be upstream data issues. So in my experience, where I've seen the best materials management system implemented within like work phase planning or an overall construction lifecycle, is when the workload is as front loaded as possible. So what that means is, active supplier management. And really it's, the suppliers and vendors are typically the lowest price point on a project for labor. So why not utilize that? Part of this is, helping provide the tools to the vendors to help you. Joel mentioned above in his slide, sequencing. So if we just take one portion of that pie that is a big rock to move at the moment, it applies not only to fabrication but also shipping. If you take a major project, say that has material coming from overseas, it's great to have it fabricated in a certain sequence, but most of that is lost if you can't also ship it and organize it in the same type of sequence. What that does is it not only reduces the receiving time but overall handling on the project. If you have something come out of a CCAN that's already packaged, in an IWP that's going to be done at site, the material handling involved in that is mitigated. And really what that does is, just reduce like the overall time on searching for materials, handling it, multiple handling it, etc. Something else that Joel mentioned is, the nomenclature, the Rosetta Stone, if you will. So a big pain point on almost any project that I've been a part of is material identification. And part of that is, a vendor or supplier will call something different than the project nomenclature. So what we see on the right here is, an existing tool today that, allows you to give your vendors and suppliers access to go in there and, build shipments for you, like live packing lists that are, integrated live into the system. So not only what's coming, but on what spipment. You can have them print barcodes that meet the project standard for identification. So if you have components or you have pipe spools or you have equipment, you can help your vendors by supplying them with the information that you want and get that at the lowest price point possible, which down the road helps when it comes to even just if we look at receiving. There was a study done that said roughly 13% of all construction work hours are spent looking for data. So if you think back to Joel's mention where they can't receive at a component level or packing lists don't match what you've ordered, when that material comes into a project site and you have your material handlers not doing actual hands-on work, but sifting through emails or following up with vendors, that's lost time that could be certainly better utilized elsewhere. So that's one of the major kind of points I wanted to get across today. Okay, now when we get to the materials and inventory management side. So really, real-time material availability and status to all project stakeholders, whether it be procurement, engineering, construction, planning, logistics. That's kind of the goal here. When we talk about a single source of truth, it's not necessarily providing a piece of functionality to every single silo, but it's somewhere that every silo integrates with and talks to, and they feel like that piece of software or that system, that single source of truth, that ecosystem, regardless of the silo, regardless of the piece of information they need, they can go to. So really through materials and inventory management system, from the field, they may be interested in like, okay, as Joel mentioned, where in the fabrication status is this pipe spool or where is this piece of steel? Excuse me. And if you look at the screenshot on the right, through a product that's available today, you can do that. So when we go through like just the fabrication steps, this is a product that you can, you can give to the hands of, the workers out there. And while they're, doing their detailing or cutting or whatever status that they come across, they can sequence it for you. When that material comes to site and your material handlers start using it, you know when it's arrived at site, if the receipt has been posted, any type of like material maintenance that needs to be done on it. And really, often an afterthought is, completing the life cycle. It's important to utilize the same ecosystem to track material once it's issued to construction. So the final kind of track that we have down there is, all of the different, installation steps along the way. So really, it's, knowing what is complete, what you can claim against, if there's bottlenecks or delays at the work front. And this, along with all the above tools, really gives planners the ability to pivot where applicable. And at the end of the day, your materials and inventory management system is there to answer the question, what is here, where is it, but also what isn't here, and when will it arrive? And a majority of the above functionality, can be enhanced or automated via the use of like sensors and technology. As an example, if we look at just, wanting to have more up-to-date ETAs for material, if you track GPS or track shipments with GPS tags, you could literally follow a shipment on a map, up to 5-10 minute granularity and know exactly where in the world that is. If you want to track shipments coming from overseas, you'll see like where in the ocean it is. Or something as simple as like utilizing RFID tags, for high cost items, and directing craft directly to the materials in the field, reducing time to locate and pick materials, which ultimately, increase the time on tools. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Eric Crivella, and let him take it from here.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. All right. So integrated materials management is elusive. It's a big rock to move in our industry and in the AWP community here. In preparing for this presentation, we asked folks who's doing the best in terms of integrated materials management. And like I said, it's a big rock for us to move. There wasn't anybody that had really definitive wins in terms of what could be truly considered integrated materials management. But what we do know is that collaboration plus integration equals certainty, right? Our friends that are developing the integrated project delivery, and fostering that sort of improvement, collaboration plus integration will equal certainty. To get there, we know it's all about the data and connected data environments, right? So what can we do to improve AWP and integrated materials management? So there's the data standards, data specs, digital threads. There's dealing with the responsibility, who's doing what, the RACI for who's doing what on a project with the materials responsibility matrix. And then a tool within the AWP CBA, the AWP capabilities assessment has gotten a refresh recently, and has some really good capabilities there in terms of consolidating and validating BOMs and integrated materials management. So we'll cover that really quickly. And lastly, nothing gets done without contracts and education. So in setting the frame for this, the topic of data, our friends at Shell and Anders Thustrup has given us permission to use a couple slides that were used at the AWP European conference that really set the stage from an owner perspective in terms of the data strategies, the data objectives, right? So being able to frame the right way in terms of where things are at and the use of these standards, right? So data, right? But the challenge here is that you need some level of a connected data environment that addresses all the disciplines, the different software systems that are used on a project from the different stakeholders involved. And then there's tens of thousands of supply chain partners. So bringing all those together in a meaningful way, doing the integration and the change management on that, requires quite a strategy. So the Shell strategy and this owner strategy here is really to look at it from this kind of envelope concept, right? And taking advantage of industry data standards as the glue between the project and the engineering data, right? So bringing all these together, using CFOS, using the various industry standards that are out there, but then doing creating a reference data library and doing the change management on that. We need to really adopt and evolve these industry data standards and to really ramp up our supply chain and the connectivity within the supply chain to build these digital ecosystems. So what sort of data are we talking about here? We need to get to a common data language, right? So Anders in his slide deck really laid out quite well all the different sources of the data and where that's coming from, but then also color-coded it and mapped it in terms of the international standards that are available and partially used. Those are the ones in green. In blue, these are ones that are international standards in development, right? And then in white there, you have the ones that are company standards only. So you can see we have a lot to do to get to better standards, industry data standards, and the use of them, the true adoption of them, and the harmonization of these, right? So this is a huge undertaking here, but it's really getting to this common data language that is going to facilitate things going forward from an integrated materials management as well as digital project delivery type of approach. So the standards, the international standards organizations that are out there are carrying the ball here, and again, the harmonization of these. So the International Oil and Gas Producers Association, IOGP, set up MOUs with a number of the industry consortium, and the harmonization effort is underway, but it's not a small undertaking, right? So within the CII and the AWP CBA, we focus on a couple of different areas, and I'll take you through those now. But these are important efforts here, and yeoman's work is being done in terms of at this data integration level for these industry standards. So we need to support these, we need to harmonize these in order to make our materials management much more integrated. So the efforts within the CBA, with the AWP Data Requirements Joint Working Group, led by Tom Morris, Steve Jones, and Dario, et cetera, from this joint working group, has created an updated version of the guideline in the data requirements, AWP data requirements, that is in review and going to be published in the near term before the end of the year. But this sets the tone in terms of, okay, what data do we need, and how could what attribution is necessary in order to start linking these together, right? And this effort builds off of the effort that occurred in terms of on the AWP TC03, the digital threads to enable the supply chain visibility on capital projects effort. This was a research team 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I guess at this point, to really create some digital threads that lead to having a better visibility over the supply chain. So they've taken the ball and run with that. But there's still some good stuff that I want to highlight coming out of the TC03, the digital threads for the supply chain enablement. So on that aspect, they also simultaneously to creating some of the digital threads and setting the framework for the data requirements effort. The TC03 group also came up with a materials responsibility matrix. So setting out early on in the project, okay, who are all the stakeholders? Who's the responsible parties? What are the different material groups? What are the different commodity types? Who's going to do what materials-wise on this project, right? And be able to set this up from a kind of a racing perspective in terms of looking at it in terms of who's going to do what overall, and then where are you at for each one of these commodity types. And it really sets the tone in terms of having a racy in terms of, who's responsible for what and what information you need to collect. So this is a really good tool. If you're looking to improve your materials management solutions and your materials management systems, this is a good framework to walk through in terms of an online tool through CII that allows you to get to a point of understanding who's going to do what materials-wise, and then being able to sort out what data you need in order to facilitate that. So much of the data that that is missing right now from the visibility of the supply chain can be mapped out, and you can strategically go after each one of those. So one of the better tools to look at that is to take advantage of the AWP capabilities assessment tool that's been developed within the Community of Business Advancement. This tool has also recently got a refresh and is in review and will be published over the next couple. But I want to highlight, this is a tool that allows you to assess where you're at AWP-wise and looking at it from the various value scenarios as well as leading practice touch points. So you can see there's 20 of them here, and a couple of them that I'll highlight here is leading practice 6, right? Consolidation and validation of bills of material by CWPs. Hugely important to do that. That's largely what we heard Joel talk about earlier, and some of the pressing problems, as well as Robert, in terms of where the gaps are in terms of the information that's missing. And then, leading practice number 7, the integrated materials management support for AWP, and really looking at things from here's where I'm at current state, here's where I want to be target state, but at a detail level. So if you were to expand out on the integrated materials management portion of that, right? So this is the leading practices 1 through 17, and then going through a mapping exercise, looking at it from current state versus the target state. So this is a great tool to go through to understand what your priorities are and where you're at in creating a phased implementation in terms of what you want to tackle in your priorities, your crawl, walk, run. And what's your level of maturity along these lines in terms of gauging that? So excellent tool along these lines in order to start looking at the details as to where you're at in your integrated materials management program and addressing the consolidation and the validation of your bombs, right? And trying to make that visible, and how do we track that dynamically? So anyway, really good tool set here available to help on that. And again, the tool set also gives examples of evidence, right? So, hey, produce a report, show me the actual template, do a demonstration of this. Where's the procedure? So the evidence to consider for each one of these. So as an assessment, as well as where to consider what to prove that this exists or is in place. So good tool set along those lines. And at the end of the day, nothing gets done without being done contractually, as well as the education and training aspects of it. We know that education is a leading indicator of success. We know that it takes, you can put all you want in the contract and your data specs, it'll be ignored. It's not until you actually go through the workshops and you train people, you get them on board with not only the fundamentals, but specifically in terms of their role specific. So if I'm a materials manager on a project, what do I need to do? What do I need to know during these phases of the project? So it's that role specific that really makes a difference in terms of coming up to speed. So consider that as part of your improvement process there. And with that, I'll kind of take it back over to our Annabella and Jewel and Robert, and we'll go through some takeaways. All right, Annabella, you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. Thanks, Eric. Great session, guys. And I'll share with you some of my impressions and my takeaways from the session, and obviously some personal experience. And I think there's a lot of discussion in the industry about coming up with these ecosystems and this perfect ecosystem that's going to help us get to where we need to go. But I think we need to be mindful of not letting perfection getting in the way of good. And what do I mean by good? Good collaboration, good communication, good stakeholder alignment on what each of us can and cannot do before that information gets put into a contract. And then I think, and Joel and Robert both alluded to this, the importance of having good engineering and good material data programmed up front. I think it's also extremely important, as I mentioned in my session, that we're organizing ourselves functionally internally within our own organizations to make sure that information is properly flowing, but then also doing that with our external partners. And, I'm not a software expert, and I know there's a lot of software out there that can help make things better, but understand what is out there and how can you leverage that. Take the time and exercise some due diligence to evaluate what's going to work for your organization and your project partners, and then make sure your IT departments are coming along with that. In some of my personal experience trying to do some of these transformations within my own organizations, we often see that IT departments can put a squash on a lot of the things that we're trying to deploy. And then last, I would say that leverage your OEM and supplier partners. Bring them in early if that's the right time, but really bring them in at the right time and challenge them to show you and share with you how can they help execute your project, keeping in mind this AWP framework. What solutions do they already have that can be leveraged in the digital space to build more robust models? How can we facilitate procurement through digital marketplaces? And at the end of the day, make sure that we have the right visibility to the materials that at the end of the day are going to make the project a reality. In addition to that, I will mention that there is a wealth of information within CII and a lot of the content that Eric has shared with us that is extremely useful. So definitely take some time to evaluate that. So I'll turn it over to Joel for his takeaways.
All right, thank you, Annabelle. My takeaways is that engineering, procurement, alignment along the path of construction drives everything. And while the gold standard is definitely for AWP is this front-end planning with the work-based planning on the tail end, we're building IWPs. If you have an option to only do one or the other, you got to do the front-end planning, because front-end planning with good material delivery is going to most likely lead to a successful project. But just building packages on the tail end of a project where you didn't have good front-end planning is not going to save your project. So you got to have, if you're doing work-based planning, you got to have that front end. It's got to support it. So that's it. How about you, Robert?
Oh, thanks, Joel. Yeah, just a couple takeaways from my side. So really, I just kind of want to drive home, like I said, the most successful implementations I've seen thus far in terms of, when we talk about integrated materials management, especially when it comes to AWP, is that really that initiative has to be owner driven. There's a consistent want for it, it seems, on all the projects, but owners get deterred, whether it be, costs from a supplier or vendor to take on what they claim additional scope or threats of delay. But I mean, at the end of the day, the project owners are the ones who own the data. So to stand by their convictions and kind of push that needle forward, is really what's going to, lead the industry initiative. And the second key takeaway for me is really just front loading as much of the effort as possible. Like I said, vendors and suppliers are probably one of the most untapped resources when it comes to a project life cycle. They happen to be the lowest, labor costs. So why not utilize that as much as possible? Thanks.
And Eric, your thoughts?
Yeah, integrated materials management is a challenged area. It's a big rock that we still need to move. I think that vendor work packages needs more process definition, right? I think we have to evolve our data standards and our digital threads in order to get there. But it's also putting in place the capabilities and the process portion of this, the procedures, the training and the education, and putting it into the contracts that makes a big deal. Ultimately, I think that we also need to find a role in how AI can play a role in integrated materials management, particularly related to getting the digital threads and the data the right way, but facilitating some of that. So I think that AI is eventually going to play a longer term role here in terms of sorting out integrated materials management. But in terms of this being a big rock that we need to move in the near term, I'm thinking that we need to have a joint working group, integrated materials management joint working group, or some initiative that combines Annabella's supply chain and some of the AWP capabilities side of it in order to really go after supplier integrated design, planning, vendor work packages, defining a maturity matrix so we know what good looks like when it comes to integrated materials management. So I'm in favor of ramping things up and taking this on as an area, focus area going forward into 2022.
Great. Well, thanks for the comments, panelists. Now we'll move to the Q&A. I may steal 5 minutes from the break time. That doesn't mean that the attendees can't go to the break on schedule, but I think they want to have a chance to ask some questions. So Steve, could you throw up the, thank you, Slido slide? And can you, attendees, please send us your questions. There is a voting feature, so if you see something that somebody said that you like, please like it, and that will move it up in the hierarchy, and then we'll be able to address those topics first. So,
Lloyd, if there's no questions on Slido yet, there was a question on the feed loop platform that asked who is developing the AWP, owner or the engineering provider?
okay, and would one of you like to address that question?
All of the above, right? Who's developing it? It has to be driven by the owner. There's no doubt about that. And not a whole lot gets done unless it's, owners in the industry do that. And then you get a kind of a top-down commitment to it. And then you get the bottom-up buy-in coming in from your fabricators and your contractors and your EPCs.
Great. So we are in an industry where TLRs or TLAs are pretty popular, 3-letter acronyms. So the question asked is, what does EWP, PWP, and CWP stand for? So would somebody like to give those definitions?
Sure. Engineering work package, procurement work package, construction work package. And there's a number of other work packages as well. And part of what I was describing here is vendor work packages, right? So equipment related work packages, vendor related work packages.
Yeah, and just a plug for CII in their RT 272. They have a report on advanced work packaging, and included in that is a pretty significant glossary. So that could be a good resource for people who want to better understand these terms. Okay, next question is, do you see owners driving forward these data standards?
I'll take that for sure. I showed the Anders slides from the European conference for that effect, right? So owners are the ones that are driving these data standards into the supply chain. And if we're going to get to digital ecosystems, that's a key part, that the owners need to drive that and to get with their supply chain to rally around. This is how we're going to have this level of visibility and this level of updating of a virtual construction model dynamically, and having the BOMs dynamically updated between engineering and the contractors, and being able to see that through the plan versus the actual, and then versus as is, and being able to have that. So yes, I see owners driving these data standards.
And if I may add to that, I think we've already seen a lot of the owners driving the data standard requirements for handover and operations and maintenance. And I think where there's additional effort that the community, the owner community, along with some key players in the contractor software and supplier space, is really defining those data standards to facilitate the capital project execution phase. What are the data standards that we need there? So definitely owners are driving it and are very much involved in that development process.
Great. So the next question, I'm going to hijack a little bit. It's what can be a good software and platform to integrate materials management efficiently? In our breakout sessions, we have a number of companies that have software, DCW, Autodesk, O3, IntelliWave, and so on. And they can explain to you what their software is and how it works and how it can be helpful to you. So I strongly recommend going to the breakout sessions to get that information. Obviously, at the conference, we're not going to endorse one software over another, but I can tell you if a company is here as a sponsor, it's because we believe they're good at advanced work packaging. And if they're a technology provider, we believe they're good at supporting your AWP material management initiative. So Steve, could you close that question and let's go to the next one. How do you match PWPs with bulk procurement? Somebody like to take a shot at that one?
Annabella, jump in there.
I think the management of bulk materials and commodity materials ends up being one of the biggest challenges that we have in the industry. I think, looking back at what we were mentioning about good engineering, having the right material data program, not just at the project level, right, but at the organization level. Do we have a dictionary, right, of all the components that we think we might need, and maintaining that and making sure that's flowing from engineering either through the model or through some standard construction details to identify those particular materials, and then aligning with the suppliers of those bulk products, whether they be commodity or engineered products, to give enough foresight or information related to the material needs that might be coming down the line to allow those particular suppliers to accommodate production and manufacturing. One of the things that we as an organization are doing to be able to manage bulk products that are not necessarily quantified upfront is we deploy what we call mobile Hilti centers to have material available for just in case or just in type of situations. But there's definitely some improvements that can be there. And I recall a superintendent at a conference one day saying, "He who manages the bulk manages the schedule." So I think there's definitely some area of opportunity there, and an area that the supply chain CBA and the AWP CBA should continue to explore.
Great. So we are officially on break time. So if you want to take the full half-hour break, go away, take your break, and then take a look at the various track sessions, breakout sessions, and pick the one you want to see, and that'll be starting in half an hour. For those of you that want to continue with the Q&A, please stay here and ask your questions. So let's go to the next question. What are the options for PCF software currently used in the industry? And can somebody help me with what the three-letter acronym PCF stands for?
I believe that
Stands for Pivotal Cloud Foundry.
Good.
It's really kind of the basis of like being able to what's the best way to describe it? It's like a newer technology, being able to it's a platform to be able to push like apps that are cloud-based kind of thing.
Okay. And I think that's probably a really good question to ask at the breakout sessions, because they're going to have some pretty technically savvy folks there, and they'll be able to point you in the direction of various softwares that are available. Let's go to the next one. Are there industry templates to ensure contractual alignment expectations between owners and EPC suppliers. Somebody want to give a comment? I happen to be facilitating the contract strategy breakout session. So I know that in that session, they're going to identify a number of contracts that are available to help with that.
Yeah,
But,
and I'll take that, Lloyd, just to maybe make a quick mention. You know, we had earlier in the year the contracting summit, and there are a number of industry templates out there. You know, perhaps maybe we can provide some links to that. But if we look specifically at CII, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, you know, there's IPD and I2PD. While they may not have a particular template, they definitely provide some guidelines on how to ensure that you have that alignment. So I would recommend folks look at the I2PD materials, and they even have an implementation tool that can be used to facilitate discussion around collaborative contracting.
great.
Clearly-
Eric, you want to say something?
Yeah, clearly integrated project delivery, there's some, you know, contract alignment expectation. There's some documentation available for that. Specific to this topic of integrated materials management, it's an area that still needs further evolved, certainly within the community and within the CII side of it.
Great. Well, thank you. So let's go to the next question. What do you do when you think you have great control over suppliers through your systems, and due to unexpected last-minute issues, which never happen, few deadlines are missed or shipments are delayed, causing major delays on the project? How do we really know what's going on in my supplier's warehouse or fab shop? I think, Robert, you probably want to give a comment to that one.
Yeah, so like I said, in my experience, the best run, you know, projects for this, they really start with, you know, vendor engagement and vendor management. So when we talk about, you know, what do we really know what's happening in my supplier's warehouse, it's because, you know, you have an active footprint at your vendor's location or daily communication. So it's really about, I think, mitigation and, you know, knowing about those delays or issues, you know, before they cause a major problem.
Great. Anybody want to add anything to that?
I'll make a comment.
Go ahead, Joel.
I make a comment that I think sometimes it's worth going on site to the fabrication shop and perform an audit. Make sure that what you get in report is actually what's happening. I know another thing that we do is we take a look at the fabrication reports and see, kind of track the spool's journey through the fabrication process, because when it hits the site, we know that's a hard point that's accurate. And we can start to get an idea how long is it taking spools to get there. And then you can kind of monitor and see, hey, do we have some outliers that aren't coming in here? Do we see things slipping? So, you know, you can kind of put more validity into the data that you're getting through some checks like that along the way.
Great.
I would add to that, you know, to the extent that you can have your MTOs, and those MTOs can be incorporated into a virtual construction model that is dynamically shared amongst the project stakeholders and kept up to date and used for the daily meetings. This is where you can have your look ahead planning that can make you more proactive instead of reactive in terms of where you're at on the project and being able to deal with these sorts of short range production planning issues, right? And then how do you adjust to that, but how do you catch them in advance? And, you know, my answer there is really having this integrated project delivery, integrated virtual construction model that's up to date, and being able to take all those, the BOMs and the takeoffs, have those directly in there and be able to see where you're at from this material visibility perspective.
Great. Thanks for that. And we actually had a clarification from the audience. They said that they think in this context, PCF stands for piping component file.
Yeah, that's what I thought as well. So the PCF or IDF type of files are, you know, can be integrated in together in order to, the trick is to have the PCF or IDF type of file, that component level of detail, the spool bolt weld, individual, bolts within there, all those components coming from the structural or the piping fabricator, in this particularly for the PCF, on the piping fabricator, to have those transmitted and put into the virtual construction model so you can create your work packages, but then do the bagging and tagging and the trowel allocations at that component fabrication level of detail. So the PCF file, at that level of detail is critical in terms of being able to understand exactly where you're at the individual piece mark / component level.
And I think this is a pretty clear example of what we were talking about. We use a lot of 3-letter acronyms, and depending on what your background is, you're going to interpret those 3 letters differently if you're an IT person, if you're a materials management person, and so on. So one of the things that we found quite helpful is the first time you use a 3-letter acronym, please spell out what it is, so that we can get common understanding. But thanks for the clarification.
Yes, thank you for correcting me on that one. That's my bad.
So the next question is there consensus on the use of the data set in SR 19-01? So I guess the next question is, can somebody clarify what SR 1901 is?
I believe
Okay.
SR stands for special report, and I think there's going to be a breakout session on the update that was done on those data requirements. So I would suggest that question be raised in that breakout session to get answers from the folks that have been involved in the development.
Yeah, the data standards group are going to give you information on the past, the present, and the future of data standards, and that's going to be one of the breakout sessions. So you'll probably be able to get some good information there. Next question. Sorry?
I was just going to add that they've done a fantastic job trying to define a lot of the data requirements, so they need to be commended for that effort.
Absolutely. So the next question is, who should manage materials on site? And Joel, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Well, personally for us, it's beneficial for us if we're able to manage the most of the material as it comes to site, if we're receiving it. Obviously, there's some bigger equipment and things like that we will not typically take. But for us, when we manage it ourselves, we're not adding any links to the chain. So it just becomes a simpler, more efficient process.
Great. Next question. How do you implement these great data management programs in your company when typically in construction, nobody likes change?
I mean, I can start by taking this one. I think, you kind of hit the nail on the head where, we have a tradition of not liking change, and, everyone's kind of adverse to it or fights it. The biggest way to break that barrier is to provide value to these stakeholders that are otherwise, standing in the way of said change. People may, be adverse to change, but they're not adverse to being more efficient and, having to do less work over time to get more work done. So I think that's the biggest thing I've taken from my work in the field is, you'll always come across people who, have 1,000,001 reasons why the way that they're doing it right now is the best. But it's just, working with them, trying to understand kind of, why they're so, adverse to the change. Is it a lack of education and, what the programs can provide? But really at the end of the day, those who adopted the most are the ones who you can show value in what you're bringing to the table for them.
Okay, great.
If I may add to that, I think it's always, wise, start out small, test it out, do a pilot, and then gather the data that you need to be able to take that to the, to the right people, to the skeptics in the organization to show the value that Robert referred to.
I'd like to add to that as well. I agree. People in the field are resistant to change. And when we came out and said, hey, we need your help in building these IWPs and defining the boundaries of the work that you want to do. But when we showed them the benefit of, hey, when we have these defined boundaries of what makes up this work front you want to do, we can pull in all this information from these different sources and provide great visibility and dynamic visibility. When they saw that piece of it, they were on board. It was not a hard sell at all. So there was initial resistance to the little bit of added work, but long term, they saw the benefit, and it actually makes their life easier. So it ended up being, I think, a pretty easy sell.
Great. And I do think it's important for people to have breaks. So we're going to do one last question and then we'll go to break. So the question we've got is 30% of the system is not integrated. Does that mean 70% of the system has integrated data? Glad we got this one.
So in one of my slides, I referred to this, that there was a study done to kind of come up with these numbers. And really it's 30% of companies have applications that don't integrate at all, which means they take a completely siloed approach. Whereas the 70% may have certain applications that talk to one another. The most common example, and kind of like, you know, putting one foot in as opposed to diving in with 2 feet, where most companies get started is with procurement. So they'll have their ERP system, you know, integrate with, say, a materials management system, and their deliverable is maybe just, you know, material identification. It's POs come into a system, they're received in some sort of system, and that information goes back to the ERP system. But that's the end of the integration. It's not integrated with the planning software. It's not integrated with, you know, construction or anything like that. So when we do say like 70% have integrated data, it's not a completely integrated ecosystem. It's like portions are integrated together.
Great. Well, I want to thank the team. That was a really informative presentation. You covered lots of ground. There are, of course, a number of questions that we didn't get to, but at the very end of the conference, we're actually going to give people a chance to address questions that weren't addressed during the conference. So we'll keep those in reserve and hopefully talk about some of them at the very end. Thanks, everyone. Breakout time now. We have a number of attendees that have tremendous knowledge, and you should be talking to them. We have sponsors who do this for a living, and you can speak to them. We have speakers that you've heard and will be hearing that you can send messages through FeedLoop to talk to. So please go to the FeedLoop portal, see which session you want to attend next, and be back in 15 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. And as Lloyd mentioned,